بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله لله تعالى. Correct your intentions. Be in this session for the sake of Allah Ta'ala only. We are at the end of As-Sirat Al-Mustaqim and its explanation, Ash-SharH Al-Qaweem. And we've reached the section on ijtihad and taqleed. And we reached the saying of the author, wal-'am wal-khas. Wal-'ammi wal-khasi. And the Mujtahid has to have encompassing knowledge of the general and the specific. يعني maybe the uncontextualized, something presented without its context or without any context. Some wording that doesn't have any particular context in it to limit those words. Wal khas, the specific, or perhaps the contextualized. What has a context? So it's not open. Like even if it were open, it has a context though. So it's not really open. So, yani, some statements in the Quran and in the Hadiths are generalized, and some are specified. And specified here means contextualized. Ash-SharH Al-'Am huwa ma 'amma shay'ain fasa'ida. The explanation is that 'am, which I'm going to translate as general, it is what includes two or more things. وَالْعُمُومُ مِنْ صِفَاتِ النُّطْقِ. And generalization is a description of statements. Generalization is a description of statements. Yani, we want to investigate wordings here. We're talking about investigating some wordings. وَلَا يَجُوزُ دَعْوَى الْعُمُومِ فِي غَيْرِهِ مِنَ الْفِعْلِ وَمَا يَجْرِي مَجْرَاهُ. So it's not permissible to claim generality, to claim that some generality is proven by an action. It's not permissible to claim that a generality is proven by an action. Rather, a generality, which is to include two or more things, is proven by a statement, not by an action. وَمَا يَجْرِي مَجْرَاهُ, or whatever is like that. So you're not going to say that because the Prophet did something, this in itself proves, yani did something without some words that go along with this action, that this doing in itself proves that it's applicable to other situations. He did something in some situation, and therefore this, what he has done, is always applicable to be done like that. An action does not prove a generality. A statement will prove a generality. وَالْخَاصُ يُقَابِلُ الْعَامِ. And the specific is what is contrary to or counterpart to general. وَالتَّخْصِيصُ تَمْيِيزُ بَعْضِ الْجُمْلَةِ. And takhsis, specification, is contextualizing some of the sentence, giving some of the sentence some context that limits it. Context means limits the scope of the words. وَيَجُوزُ تَخْصِيصُ الْكِتَابِ بِالْكِتَابِ. It is permissible to give context to something in the Quran by something else in the Quran. Nahu, for example, Allah says, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوءٍ. 228th verse of Surah Al-Baqarah. It means the divorced women wait for 3 intervals. So divorced women, that's open. You say divorced woman, that's all, then doesn't that include whether she's pregnant or she's not pregnant? If you only say divorced, then she has to wait for 3 cycles? Yes. Ash-Shamil li awqatil ahmal. So this ayah, this 228th verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, which means the divorced women wait, they keep themselves in waiting for 3 intervals. This would include, by its mere wording, the pregnant women. فَخَصَّ. But it has been given context. It is limited to some context. بِقَوْلِهِ, by what God said, وَأُولَاتُ الْأَحْمَالِ أَجَلُهُنَّ أَن يَضَعْنَ حَمْلَهُنَّ. The pregnant women, their expiration is until they drop their load. That's the 4th verse of Surah Al-Talaq. So this verse gives specifically the judgment of pregnant women. How long do they have to wait? The first verse gives a general statement, an open statement, an uncontextualized statement about divorced women waiting. So we know then that the first verse is not about pregnant women. Pregnant women are excluded from this first verse, despite the openness of its words. Who does this job? The Mujtahid does this job. وَيَجُوزُ تَخْصِيصُ الْكِتَابِ بِالسُّنَّةِ. And it's permissible to give context to an ayah from the Quran by a hadith. كَتَخْصِيصِ قَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ. Like specifying what God said, exalted is He. This verse, which means God commands you concerning your children. Al-ayah Ash-Shamili lil-Mawlud al-Kafir. This ayah that in which God commands you concerning your children. God gives you directives concerning your children. According to the openness of those words, this would include disbelieving children. الشامل للمولود الكافر بحديث الصحيحين. That open statement is restricted by the hadith of the 2 authentic books. لا يرث المسلم الكافر ولا يرث الكافر المسلم. The Muslim does not inherit from the blasphemer, and the blasphemer does not inherit from the Muslim. وَيَجُوزُ تَخْصِيصُ السُنَّةِ بِالْكِتَابِ. And it's valid to give context to a hadith by something in the Quran. مثل تخصيص حديث الصحيحين, like giving context to the hadith in the two authentic books. لا يقبل الله صلاة أحدكم إذا أحدث حتى يتوضأ. Allah does not accept any one of your prayers, the prayers of any one of you, when he breaks his wudu, until he makes wudu. So, what's open there? Is there something open there? Yeah, this would include being sick. Allah doesn't accept the prayer of one of you when he breaks his wudu until he makes wudu. Even the sick person. So there's an ayah from the Quran that shows the context of this hadith. بقوله تعالى وإن كنتم مرضى إلى قوله سبحانه فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا. That's the 43rd verse of Surah Al-Ma'idah. وإن وردت السنة بالتيمم أيضا بعد نزول الآية. So there's an ayah from the Quran that means if you were sick until, that's the 6th verse of Al-Ma'idah, until the 43rd verse, and you didn't find water, then make tayammum. So Allah does not accept the prayer of one of you if he breaks his wudu until he makes wudu. Not a single one of you? Under the context of the one who's able to make wudu, not the sick person who can't use the water, and not the traveler who can't find water. So then we know that that hadith is limited, and the proof for that limitation is here in the Quran. Although there are also other hadiths that have rules of tayammum in them that would limit this hadith too. It's possible to bring some hadiths that would limit this hadith. Allah does not accept the prayer of one of you if he breaks wudu until he makes wudu. Allah does not accept the prayer of one of you when he commits a minor impurity until he makes wudu. There are also other hadiths about tayammum that show the context of this hadith. But we're bringing ayahs that show the context of this hadith to take the lesson that the Quran also can give context to some hadiths. وَيَجُوزُ تَخْصِيصُ السُنَّةِ بِالسُنَّةِ. And it is permissible to give context to a hadith by a hadith. مثل تخصيص حديث الصحيحين, like the hadith of the two authentic books. فيما سقط السماء والعيون العشر بحديث ليس فيما دون 5 أوسق صدقة. Like giving context to this hadith. Anything watered by the sky and the springs, any crop that's watered by the sky or the springs, that is, any crop that the farmer does not have to spend on its irrigation because the rainfall or the spring or the river or some water source nearby suffices him and he doesn't have a water bill for his crops. Any crops that are watered by the sky or the springs, 1/10 of them is due for zakat. 1/10 are due for zakat. So what limits this hadith? لَيْسَ فِي مَا دُونَ 5 أَوْسُقٍ صَدَقَةٍ. That But if your harvest is less than 5 wasaqs, then there's no zakat on them. So the first hadith is open, doesn't give regard to how much your yield is in the first place. If you only went by this first hadith, the meaning would be any crops that you don't have a water bill for those crops, then you have to pay a tenth, regardless of how much is your yield. So is it really that open? No, there's context, which is a limitation, that you have to have a minimum amount first. Anything less than the amount of 5 wasaqs, there is no charity, there's no zakat for it. Muttafaqun alayh. This hadith is narrated by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. You asked me to repeat. Did you get what you wanted me to repeat? Okay, you're welcome. وَيَجُوزُ تَخْصِيصُ النَّصِّ بِالْقِيَاسِ. And it's permissible to limit, to give context to religious document like the Quran or the Hadith by the scholar's legal comparison. The scholar's legal comparison can be evidence for a context that an ayah has or a hadith has. So when you've gone that far, you're way beyond the hadith denier, because hadith denier is going to stop at the hadiths in the first place. All he wants is the Quran. We're talking about explaining the verses of the Quran by verses of the Quran, showing the context of some verses by other verses. And we went further to say that you could show the context of some verses of the Quran by some hadiths and vice versa. Right there, that far, a hadith denier doesn't go, because he doesn't even accept the hadith. So let alone here, now we went even further. We're saying it's possible to give context to an ayah or a hadith by a scholar's legal comparison, by a Mujtahid scholar's legal comparison. وَنَعْنِي بِالنَّصِّ قَوْلَ اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى وَقَوْلَ الرَّسُولِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. And by the text, we mean the saying of God, exalted is He, and the saying of the Messenger, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَمِثَالُ تَخْصِيصِ الْكِتَابِ بِالْقِيَاسِ. An example of giving context to a verse of the Quran by a scholar's legal comparison is قَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى, the saying of God, exalted is He. الزانية والزاني فاجلدوا كل واحد منهما 100 جلدة. It means the female adulteress and the male adulterer. Whip each one of them, lash each one of them 100 lashes. That's second verse of Surah An-Nur. خُصَّ عُمُومُهُ شَامِلُ لِلْأَمَةِ. So this verse, as it stands with its own wording, it doesn't mention being free or slave. So the words on their own are open. But the generality of this ayah is restricted. Yani, this ayah has a context. It's only about the free man and the free woman. So its generality, which is inclusive of the slave woman, is limited by another ayah that restricts the slave woman, yani takes the slave woman out of that ayah. فَعَلَيْهِنَّ نِصْفُ مَا عَلَى الْمُحْصَنَاتِ مِنَ الْعَذَابِ. The 25th verse of Surah An-Nisa, about the slave women. On them, if the slave woman commits adultery, then she gets half of what the free women get of punishment. وَخُصَّ عُمُومُهُ أَيْضًا بِالْعَبْدِ الْمَقِيسِ عَلَى الْأَمَةِ. And then the male slave, the generality that includes the male slave was limited by comparing the male slave to the female slave. Or what does that mean? Follow this process here of what happened. Let's look at the ayah. What's the Shaykh talking about here? He's saying it's permissible to limit, to give context to an ayah or a hadith by a scholar's legal comparison. So he gives you an example. But this example has a process. So it starts with this ayah. الزانية والزاني فاجلدوا كل واحد منهما مئة جلدة. The second ayah of Surah An-Nur. The female and male fornicator, lash both of them 100 lashes. Okay. So those words alone would include free and slave. خص عمومه شامل للأمة. So there's an ayah, first of all, before we look at the legal comparison. An ayah that limits the word zaniya here. Zaniya, the female fornicator. There's an ayah that gives context to who this female fornicator is, which is that this female fornicator here in this second ayah of Surah An-Nur is a free woman. What's that ayah? That ayah is that Allah says, فَعَلَيْهِنَّ نِصْفُ مَا عَلَى الْمُحْصَنَاتِ مِنَ الْعَذَابِ. The slave women have half of what the free women get of punishment. So then we knew that this 100 lashes here in Surah An-Nur is for free women. Because slave women would get 50 lashes. So we know this is for free women. Okay, where's the scholar's legal comparison at? It's coming. So now, what about here, going back to the ayah, what about this word az-zani, the male fornicator? How do we know that that's only for a freeman too? We have proof that the az-zaniyah, the female fornicator in this ayah, is only for the free woman. Where's the proof that the word zani here is only for the free man? Are we going to assume? No, we're not going to assume. Yani, is there an ayah like there was an ayah for the first case? No. Rather, the scholars made qiyas. And they said the proof that this word zani here is for the free man is by comparing a slave man to a slave woman. By comparing a slave man to a slave woman. So the meaning here is, this word zaniya is for the free woman. Because another ayah proved that the slave woman is excluded from this. Now that ayah that proves that the slave woman is excluded from this doesn't prove that the slave man is excluded from this. Because that's about slave woman, not man. It's not about slaves in general, it's about women, slave women. So we knew from an ayah that the slave women are excluded from the word zaniya here as far as getting 100 lashes. That proof that proved that slave women are not included in zaniya, it does not prove that slave men are not included in zani, because it's not about slave men so that it would prove that. It's about slave women. So what's our proof to exclude slave men from this word as zani and say that's only for free men? The answer is the scholars made a legal comparison. They compared the slave man to the slave woman. They compared the slave man to the slave woman. What do the slave man and the slave woman have in common here? Also, the slave man only gets half of what the free person gets. So then the slave man must be excluded from this verse too, in terms of 100 lashes. Maybe this topic is working your brain, massaging your lobes, which that's a good thing. Usul al-fiqh is challenging for the mind. The mujtahids, that's why the mujtahids are the top scholars. They can handle these fine details here, these fine differences between things. We thank Allah Ta'ala that we are allowed to even get a taste of this.